What does it mean to be a man in Hollywood? For decades, the answer seemed carved in stone. Square jawlines, stoic silences, clenched fists. The screen adored those who smoked without flinching, fought without feeling, and kissed without trembling. Masculinity, for the longest time, was a rigid costume stitched by studios, and actors wore it even when it didn't fit. But behind the velvet curtain, a different kind of man emerged. Some were quietly defiant, others brazenly complex. They didn't just act, they existed as contradictions, gentle but fierce, broken yet magnetic, vulnerable and unshakably strong. They shattered the mold, not with rebellion, but with authenticity. They taught Hollywood that manhood isn't about domination, it's about depth. That silence can speak louder than violence. That to cry on screen isn't weakness, but an act of radical courage. This is not a list of heartthrobs or forgotten icons. This is a countdown of 20 stars who rewrote the very definition of manhood, not just in cinema, but in culture. Some paid a price for being ahead of their time. Others became timeless because they dared to be different. Who do you think was the most fearless man in Hollywood? Not with his fists, but with his truth. A.E.A. Hasson, Montgomery Clift. The fragility that shattered the mold. He never raised his voice. He never needed to. While other leading men strutted across screens with bravado, Montgomery Clift introduced something radical to the image of masculinity: fragility. His eyes didn't pierce, they trembled. His voice wasn't commanding, it cracked just enough to feel real. And that subtle vulnerability was more powerful than any punch thrown on screen. In A Place in the Sun, he portrayed anguish with such aching restraint that it left audiences breathless. In From Here to Eternity, he gave us a soldier not driven by bloodlust, but by internal conflict and quiet honor. These were not performances, they were revelations. Clift wasn't acting out pain. He was pain, bottled in a beautiful, broken frame. Off-screen, he defied the era's norms even more. He refused to marry for publicity. He resisted the studio system's demands to conform, even as it quietly punished him. After the car crash that disfigured his face, he could have disappeared. Instead, he kept acting not to preserve vanity, but to prove that manhood could survive being shattered. Montgomery Clift didn't just challenge Hollywood's idea of what a man should look like. He dared to show what a man could feel like. Was it courage, or a kind of quiet defiance that made him Hollywood's most reluctant revolutionary? AGA-2, Paul Newman, kindness as rebellion. He had the eyes of a movie god, but the soul of a man uninterested in worship. While others flexed muscles or lit cigarettes with practiced apathy, Paul Newman made kindness his weapon. In Cool Hand Luke, he played a man who refused to break, not with rage, but with a half smile and silent resolve. In The Verdict, he gave voice to broken men who still believed in justice. There was power in his restraint. He never yelled to prove dominance. He whispered, and the world listened. Off-screen, he dismantled the archetype even further. He stayed married. He gave away his fortune. He laughed at vanity, yet somehow redefined cool. He wasn't acting like a good man. He was one, and that made him dangerous to a system built on performative masculinity. Newman's rebellion wasn't loud. It was subtle, persistent, and deeply human. He didn't break the mold, he outgrew it. What's more, revolutionary, to fight the system or to thrive without ever becoming it. AGE-3, James Stewart, the gentleman weaponized. He was Hollywood's everyman, which made him the most dangerous man of all. James Stewart didn't punch, he pleaded. He didn't dominate, he endured. And somehow, that endurance had more weight than violence. In It's a Wonderful Life, he spiraled into despair, not with melodrama, but with the quiet, relatable ache of a man who'd lost his sense of worth. In Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, he stood alone, trembling, but unyielding. During World War II, he didn't play a soldier, he became one, flying bomber missions, returning not as a conquering hero, but as a man changed by the horror he refused to dramatize. His post-war performances darkened. The stammer turned into something haunted. That awkward charm became the shell of someone who had seen too much. James Stewart proved that goodness was not weakness. That decency, when tested, becomes a form of steel. Was his greatest act not his performances, but the fact that he made virtue cinematic? 1-4, Sidney Poitier, Dignity as Detonation. He didn't scream, he didn't punch back, and yet every time Sidney Poitier appeared on screen, Hollywood shook. At a time when black men were allowed only to serve or entertain, Poitier stood tall, silent, and intellectually formidable. In Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, he held his own against white liberal guilt with clarity, not anger. In the Heat of the Night, when slapped, he slapped back on camera, shattering more than just fictional tension. He shattered history, but it was how he held space that changed everything. His presence wasn't just representation, it was confrontation. Without raising his voice, he forced audiences to listen. Without demanding change, he embodied it. In refusing to play the clown, the servant, or the sidekick, Poitier became a new blueprint, one that didn't fit the system's mold and didn't ask permission to exist. Is true masculinity about dominance or about refusing to be diminished? AGAT-5. Richard Burton. Masculinity as self-destruction. He had the voice of a prophet and the soul of a man, always one breath away from collapse. Richard Burton didn't just perform masculinity, he dismantled it in real time. His Hamlet wasn't noble, it was fractured. His Antony wasn't regal, it was raw and drunk on both love and war. Even off-screen, his life was a paradox. The literary intellect who lived like a bruiser, the theater purist who sold out for millions, the romantic who kept burning the one thing he loved most, Elizabeth Taylor. Burton's masculinity was not aspirational. It was terrifyingly honest. There was no pretense, only contradictions. He read poetry like it was whiskey, and drank whiskey like it was truth serum. Hollywood wanted to tame him, but you can't mold what keeps breaking itself apart. Was Richard Burton performing masculinity or confessing the impossibility of ever living up to it? 1-6. Marlon Brando. The instinct that refused to behave. He didn't just walk into scenes, he erupted into them. Marlon Brando made male vulnerability dangerous. In A Streetcar Named Desire, he turned brute force into erotic tension. In On the Waterfront, he held a pigeon like a child, then broke your heart with a sentence. I could have been a contender. He was primal, erratic, magnetic, masculine, in ways that felt feral and unscripted. What made Brando revolutionary wasn't his rage, it was his chaos. He was unpredictable. He mumbled. He moved like he didn't know what his body would do next. He felt. And he made the audience feel unsafe, not because he was violent, but because he was real. He burned through fame, respectability, and even his own legend. He couldn't be branded. He was a storm wearing human skin. Did Brando invent a new masculinity, or just stop pretending like the old one ever fit? AGA-7. Gregory Peck. Strength without swagger. He never needed to prove himself. That was his power. In a world of clenched jaws and cocked fists, Gregory Peck carried himself with a quiet moral gravity. As Atticus Finch in To Kill a Mockingbird, he didn't just deliver justice, he modeled it. He stood in a courtroom, surrounded by hatred, and never raised his voice. He didn't have to. The weight of his integrity did all the speaking. Peck's masculinity wasn't performative, it was principled. Off-screen, he advocated for civil rights, spoke out against censorship, and rejected roles that compromised his beliefs. He knew exactly what kind of man he was, and that clarity made him dangerous to a system built on compromise. He wasn't flashy, he was formidable. Can moral courage be louder than all the guns and glory combined? AGAATHE. Steve McQueen. Silence as a language of power. He didn't say much. He didn't have to. Steve McQueen understood that silence could be louder than monologues. In Bullet, he barely spoke, but every glance, every motion behind the wheel was a statement of control. In The Great Escape, he didn't play the hero. He played the man who waits, who calculates, who acts only when it matters. His masculinity wasn't noisy, it was compressed tension. Off-screen, he was a loner, a racer, a man who mistrusted fame. He wasn't interested in being adored. He wanted freedom from studios, from expectations, from definitions. His rebellion was minimalist, stripped down to essence. He didn't need swagger, he had stillness. And that, somehow, was even more dangerous. Isn't it strange how the quietest men leave the loudest echoes? AW-9. Clint Eastwood. The solitude that became myth. He never asked for understanding. He only demanded space. Clint Eastwood's rise was built on the archetype of the lone gunslinger, but he didn't stop there. Over decades, he mutated that image, transforming the cowboy into a philosopher, the avenger into a ghost of regret. His roles in Unforgiven and Gran Torino were not about killing, they were about the cost of having killed. His masculinity was not the absence of feeling, it was the burial of it. And in that burial, he forced audiences to consider what was lost. Tenderness, trust, redemption. Eastwood didn't just play tough men, he played men trying to remember why they were tough in the first place. He made solitude cinematic, and then he made it feel like a warning. Is strength still strength when it comes wrapped in silence and sorrow? Hassan 0. William Holden, the man Hollywood used up. He looked like the ideal, until the cracks began to show. William Holden had it all: the jawline, the charm, the spotlight. But underneath, there was a man wrestling with irrelevance, with disillusionment, with the slow erosion of meaning. In Sunset Boulevard, he didn't just play a screenwriter selling out. He was that man trapped in a system that chewed up sincerity and spat out cynicism. Later in Network, he was the voice of weary wisdom, the man who'd seen too much, said too little, and finally spoke up too late. Holden's masculinity wasn't aspirational. It was exhausted, and in that exhaustion, there was truth. He wasn't a legend because he stood tall. He became one because he showed us what it looked like to fall slowly, with eyes wide open. What happens when being the man means being the first to break? Hashunon Jack Nicholson, the madness that made sense. He didn't play crazy, he dared you to call him that. Jack Nicholson turned chaos into charisma. In One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, he wasn't just rebelling against the system, he made rebellion feel like survival. His grin wasn't warmth, it was a warning. His eyebrows alone could outact an entire generation. But beneath the theatrics was always precision, calculation, pain. What made Nicholson dangerous was that he brought humanity to his madness. His characters weren't monsters, they were men pushed too far, or simply seeing too clearly. In The Shining, he showed how fragility masquerades as menace. In Chinatown, he revealed that cynicism might be the last refuge of the honest. Jack didn't fit into Hollywood. He warped Hollywood around himself. When you put on the mask of madness, what happens when it stops coming off? AGAH1 Hasson 2. Burt Lancaster, the body politic. He was brawn. He was Broadway. He was both fists and freedom. Burt Lancaster began as a circus acrobat, morphed into a Hollywood hunk, and then almost imperceptibly became an intellectual force. He didn't just play strong men, he played complicated ones. In Elmer Gantry, he was a preacher selling salvation like a con man. In Birdman of Alcatraz, he gave tenderness to a killer. Off-screen, he fought for civil rights, opposed McCarthyism, and championed progressive politics. He was a muscle-bound idealist, a man who believed cinema could challenge as much as it could entertain. While other stars protected their image, Lancaster used his for leverage and not always for comfort. He proved that masculinity could be athletic and articulate, spiritual and subversive. Can a strong man still shake the world without ever raising his voice? AEGA, Hasson 3, Warren Beatty, the star who controlled the script. He didn't just act. He orchestrated. Warren Beatty understood that the real power in Hollywood wasn't being in front of the camera, it was owning what the camera saw. He seduced the industry the way he seduced audiences, slowly, deliberately, with full control. In Shampoo, he exposed the emptiness behind beauty. In Reds, he turned politics into passion. While others chased roles, Beatty created them. He blurred the line between star and mogul, heartthrob and ideologue. He was never just a pretty face, he was a mind behind a mask, and that mask never slipped unless he let it. His masculinity wasn't reactive, it was curated. Every glance, every pause, every headline calculated. And yet, behind the polish, there was always a sense that he knew exactly what it cost to stay in control. Is true power silent? Or is it simply dressed better than the rest? Hasson 4, Alain Delon, the ice beneath the beauty. He was beautiful, but it wasn't warmth, it was a kind of danger. Alain Delon didn't perform masculinity, he distilled it. In Le Samurai, he moved like a ghost in a tailored suit, silent, unreadable, lethal. His characters didn't talk, they observed, calculated, waited. He wasn't the kind of man who fought for attention. He made the world turn to see what he would do next. Delon brought a uniquely European detachment to stardom. There was no need to explain, no need to justify. His masculinity was cool, almost surgical, built not on bravado, but on control. Yet behind the aloofness, there was melancholy. A man who knew too much to trust the world, and too little to escape it. He didn't explode, he froze. And in doing so, he became a mirror the audience couldn't look away from. Can someone be both hollow and hypnotic and still feel like the most masculine presence in the room? On Haitian 5, Robert Redford, the golden boy with a rebel soul. He looked like a dream. He chose to make it political. Robert Redford had the face of American mythology, sun-kissed, clean-cut, effortless. Hollywood would have gladly cast him in 1,000 romantic leads. But Redford had other plans. In All the President's Men, he made journalism a battlefield. In The Candidate, he turned charm into a critique of democracy. He took the tools of Hollywood and aimed them back at the system. Off-screen, he founded Sundance, gave voice to the independent, and disappeared when fame became noise. He never shouted, but he never stopped speaking either. His masculinity wasn't forged in confrontation, but in conviction. He was living proof that you could be graceful and grounded, that you could question everything and still look like the answer. He didn't just represent the American ideal, he revised it. What's more radical? To burn the system down or to shine so brightly it exposes every flaw? X. Peter O'Toole, the prince who refused the throne. He moved like royalty. He lived like a vagabond, and Hollywood had no idea what to do with him. Peter O'Toole didn't act, he possessed. In Lawrence of Arabia, he made grandeur feel intimate and ambition feel cursed. His eyes burned with a mix of wonder and doom. His diction was perfect, but his soul seemed constantly unraveling. He was trained, eloquent, magnetic, yet off-screen, he chased chaos. He drank too much, joked too darkly, and turned down knighthood, not out of humility, but defiance. He refused to be polished, even as his every gesture screamed elegance. His masculinity was Shakespearean, layered, lyrical, on the verge of madness. He didn't want to fit, he wanted to haunt. Can a man be both myth and mess and still remain unforgettable? Hassoun 7, James Coburn, cool as a philosophy. He didn't rush, he didn't explain, he didn't need to. James Coburn embodied a masculinity that didn't announce itself, it just existed. He wasn't loud, but he lingered. In The Magnificent Seven, he spoke with movement more than words. In Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, he carried death like an old friend. He wasn't trying to steal the scene gave itself to him. Coburn's appeal came from his ease. The lean frame, the raspy voice, the half-smile that made you think he knew something you didn't. He brought stillness into a business addicted to noise. And somehow, that made him more powerful. He didn't chase myth. He became it by doing less and meaning more. Is there strength in not needing to be noticed because you know you always are? Hassoun 8, John Cassavetes, the soul stripped bare. He didn't portray men, he exposed them. John Cassavetes wasn't interested in heroes. He was obsessed with raw, unruly, unfiltered humanity. In Husbands and a Woman Under the Influence, he explored male fragility like a surgeon without anesthesia. There were no clean lines, no easy answers, just men stumbling through intimacy, friendship, failure. His masculinity was messy, and that was the point. He didn't play it safe. He made the audience uncomfortable. He directed like he lived, intuitively, chaotically, truthfully. While others hid behind crafted personas, Cassavetes laid himself bare even when it hurt to watch. He didn't act like a man. He questioned what a man even was. What if the bravest thing a man could do was to admit he didn't have it all figured out? Hassoun, Harvey Keitel, the wound that walked. He walked like a fighter, but always looked like he'd already lost something. Harvey Keitel redefined male intensity. In Mean Streets, he was a man split between faith and fury. In Bad Lieutenant, he descended into shame with no filter, no vanity, no safety net. He didn't hide the darkness. He dragged the audience into it. Keitel's masculinity was bruised, trembling, raw. He made pain visible without explanation. He didn't cry to manipulate. He cried because there was nothing else left. And in doing so, he broke the rule that men must always be composed. He gave us the post-war, post-myth man, sacred and profane in the same breath. He made us ask, how much can one man lose and still call himself whole? Isn't there a kind of strength in falling apart on purpose and in public? #20, Daniel Day-Lewis, the last of the mythmakers. He didn't play roles. He disappeared into them and sometimes never came back. Daniel Day-Lewis wasn't just an actor, he was a craftsman of identity, sculpting men out of silence, obsession, and pain. In My Left Foot, he gave dignity to limitation. In There Will Be Blood, he transformed capitalism into a character and made its face terrifyingly human. In The Age of Innocence, he whispered repression so convincingly it shattered hearts. What set Day-Lewis apart wasn't just his method, it was his totality. He didn't perform masculinity, he embodied its ghosts. The father, the tyrant, the dreamer, the destroyer all lived within him, layered and simmering. And then, with haunting clarity, he walked away from it all. His final act wasn't a role, it was refusal. Refusal to chase legacy. Refusal to play the game. A man who proved that to vanish on your own terms might be the most masculine gesture of all. Is the most powerful myth the one that ends before anyone can break it? Bonus fact, the photograph that was never published. In the archives of Life magazine lies a photograph that never made it to print. It shows three men, Montgomery Clift, Paul Newman, and Marlon Brando, standing side by side on a studio lot in 1956. The image is haunting not because of who they were, but because of who they had not yet become. Newman still uncertain, Brando still untouched by self-destruction, Clift already beginning to vanish. The photographer later said it was the quietest shoot he ever witnessed. No banter, no ego, just three young men, all of them beautiful, all of them carrying something unspoken behind their eyes. Something weightier than fame, something closer to fear. That image was shelved. Editors felt it was too stark, too sad, too fragile for public consumption. But maybe that's what it captured best. Not a moment of glory, but a collision of futures. One man who would survive through empathy, one who would rebel through chaos, and one who would never truly heal. They weren't just redefining masculinity, they were warning us what it might cost. Would you rather be remembered as a legend or understood as a man? Hollywood has never lacked men. It has lacked space for men to be complicated. These 20 stars didn't just act, they embodied contradictions that rewrote what it meant to be strong, to be wounded, to be seen. They weren't perfect. That's what made them unforgettable. But here's the question: which version of manhood truly lasts the myth, or the man who dares to unmake it? Let us know which story stayed with you, and which one you think the industry still isn't ready to tell. And if you're drawn to the truths hidden beneath the spotlight, subscribe, share, and join us as we keep peeling back the curtain.